Hello and welcome to Keeping It Young podcast, conversations about marriage, family, and ministry life. I'm Dave.
And I'm Bethlie.
And we are the Youngs.
Welcome.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us again this week as we're right in the middle of our, kind of at the beginning. There's so many that's yet coming up.
Right, true.
Of our conflict resolution series. And we sure enjoyed working through the marriage series.
Right.
And toddlers. And children, and last week kind of kicking off the teen and continuing that today.
Yes.
So we're really excited about that. Glad you joined us. If you know somebody that you think this would be a help, an encouragement, a blessing to, then reach out to them and share and let them know about our series. And we'd love for them to know about that. Before we jump in, though, we wanted to, again, tell you about our sponsor, MyPillow. If you've not yet visited their website, check it out, mypillow.com. Use the promo code YOUNG.
Yes.
And there's just all kinds of special offers. You can save up to 66%. And so check that out if you haven't done so. Bethlie and I highly recommend their product and are very thankful for their sponsorship of the Keeping It Young podcast.
I was going to add to that. Now, gentlemen, I don't know how early you start shopping for Christmas because it does seem pretty early. We're recording this in August, but I would go and just look, because I will tell you that your wife would love their towels and she would love their slippers. The house slippers are just amazing. I wear mine all the time.
And that is true. She has them all the time with her. So check those out. And there's still a few more weeks. We still have some openings, and we would love for you to join us in Gatlinburg at the Couples Prayer Advance.
Yes.
And we're inviting our Keeping It Young podcast listeners to join us for that prayer advance, because Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge is beautiful that time of year.
Yes, it is.
And we have a lovely venue where we're meeting, and we're just really looking forward to that. We're going to be there, Lord willing. Our producer is going to be there with us.
Wonderful.
And we also are just so excited that we get to spend some time with our friends, the Vaughns, Harold and Debbie. They have a phenomenal ministry, so they'll be speaking some. There'll be some counseling available. We have our friends, the Dan Vaughns are coming, not related.
The other Vaughns.
But they're coming to help us with music. It's going to be a phenomenal couples time, and I hope you'll come. There's free time, so you can do some shopping, especially if you join us on Thursday as well as Friday and Saturday. But that's coming up in October. KeepingItYoungPodcast.com has information about that at the top of the page.
Yes.
And so check it out and join us. We would be delighted and thrilled and happy if you would. And Bethlie and I need to tell you as well, we are so excited because of the fact that God has given us a lovely granddaughter.
Yes.
And she's a few weeks old now. And so we're just really, really glad that God gave us a healthy grandbaby. And Joshua and Bethany are incredibly blessed parents. They're just really doing a great job, and we could not be happier.
Yes.
And Bethlie's just glowing and showing me photos all the time. And so this is just really, really exciting part of our lives. So
yes, it is.
Check us out on social media, because we'll have photos on there as well.
There we go. We are thrilled to be Papa and Mimi to little Ellie Joy. And in fact, when you hear this podcast, this episode, we will be, Lord willing, in California, cuddling her and snuggling her. So.
That's so true. And we're looking forward to that. And so check us out on social media. We'd love to show you photos of our beautiful little granddaughter.
Yes.
And that would be a blessing to us. And I know a blessing to you as well.
Of course. Who wouldn't want to see a young grandbaby?
Absolutely. All right, let's jump in. Are you ready to get started?
Yes, let's do it.
We are talking about conflict resolution between parents and teenagers. And although we mentioned toddlers and we talked some about children, this one really is where, I guess, when you think conflict resolution with your children, the teen years, the tweenie years, if I can use a modern term, this is really where it gets exciting.
Yes.
And a lot of parents become very frustrated at this time. And Bethany and I just really don't think you have to be.
No,
and it's not easy. It's not easy, but it can be done. And so just if you joined us last week, now if you didn't, you need to go back and listen to last week's episode, because last week we just kind of kicked things off with a discussion about destructive ways to argue. And we talked about withdrawal, name-calling fights, the belittling, the invalidating each other, and that sort of thing. And that's worth reviewing. Any thought
I
looking
was
back?
just looking at our notes here, destructive ways to argue. I would even just go so far to say as you probably shouldn't be arguing with your teenager. All of these different ways to communicate that we talked about in last week's episode that we called destructive ways to argue, these are destructive ways to communicate with your teen or preteen, as the case may be. And I would just draw that line and say,
Sure.
I'm not going to do this. We're not going to have name calling in this house. We're not going to belittle one another. We're not going to be negative towards one another. And if we have a conflict come up, we're going to learn to communicate in healthy ways. So we're going to talk about that today.
And I think part of the reason we think of it in terms of an argument is because normally these things show up when there's a disagreement.
Yes.
And in normal day-to-day conversation, this often doesn't show up. So these are dealing with issues where there's a disagreement, there's a problem, and we're trying to solve that problem.
Right.
Let's talk just for a moment about the goal.
Okay.
And one of the things we have to remember as moms and dads, when God gives us children, our goal should be to bring our children to maturity so that they can enjoy true freedom.
Yes.
And we need to talk about that because we don't just, our goal is not just to get the kids out of the house. Our goal is not just to win,
Right.
our disagreements, but our goal is to train our children, to bring them up to a place of maturity in their life. And our goal is for our kids to enjoy true freedom.
Right.
And one author said it like this. He said, real freedom is having the inner power to do what he or she knows is best for all concerned. That's a huge statement.
Yes, it is.
Real freedom is having the inner power to do what he or she knows is best for all concerned. Because here's what happens even in marriages. Even in marriages, a lot of times problems come because the husband begins to make decisions based on what's best for him. Or the wife makes decisions based on what's best for her.
True.
And really that shows up in the family in the teen years because teens can begin living their life. No, this is what I want. This is what I like.
Right.
And moms and dads can balk at that. No, this is what we want.
Right.
And our goal is to teach them that they can enjoy true freedom, which is having that inner power to do what is best for everybody that's concerned.
True.
Immaturity, on the other hand, the author said, immaturity is lacking the power to do what he or she knows is right and lacking the power to delay gratification. In other words, I want to have fun right now.
Right.
But life has this thing about I have to do the work, I have to submit, I have to learn obedience,
Right.
I have to learn discipline. So moms and dads, remember that right now as we're talking about conflict with our teenagers and our tweenies, remember your goal. Focus on your goal. You want your children to grow to a place of maturity so that it can enjoy true freedom.
Absolutely. And this, just talking about this reminds me of that verse in 3 John where it says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in truth.
Absolutely.
And so that is how they get real freedom, knowing the truth of the Word of God, knowing that the Holy Spirit resides inside them and that they can have true freedom when they are following what is right. And also, not only does that bring them joy, but that brings the parents much joy to hear that their children are walking in true biblical freedom.
Yes, it does. And Solomon mentions that quite frequently when he says things like, a child left to himself brings his mom to shame.
Yes.
His mother to shame. On the other hand, he talks about a well-trained child brings delight. And it's delightful for everybody involved, for the child and for the parents as well.
Yes.
So let's start by just reviewing the goal. Remember that your goal is to bring your children to maturity so that they can enjoy true freedom.
Yes.
And then let's go to Proverbs 18 today. And the reason I want to go to Proverbs 18 is it is a chapter that is absolutely full of advice about conflicts, the tongue, how to handle things, how not to handle things.
Right.
And so I went through Proverbs 18, and Bethlie and I are going to just kind of walk through it with you. In Proverbs 18, you'll see there's a number of dangers to avoid. And then you'll see there are a number of areas to develop. And then Bethlie and I will add just at the end today about some actions that all of us can take in light of it.
Yes.
So let's start with the dangers to avoid.
All right.
And this first verse is interesting. Let me read the first one. Proverbs 18, verse 1. Through desire a man, having separated himself, seeketh and intermeddleth with all wisdom. And what Solomon is saying right there is that, depending on how you take the verse, it does appear that he's saying that when we separate ourselves, we isolate ourselves, it does allow us to seek and to get connected to wisdom.
Right.
And that's a good thing.
Yes.
So isolation in that sense would be a good thing. But we want to start today, and I want to look at it from a different angle and just talk from about the danger of isolation. Because a lot of times what we end up doing in a conflict is we separate ourselves from it.
Right.
We're not looking for wisdom. We're not trying to solve it.
True.
What we end up doing, though, is we're pouting, or we're frustrated, or we're irritated, or we just don't want to take the time to work through a problem. So there's always a danger of isolation.
Right.
And that's a huge one because so many people run from issues, run from conflict.
Right.
And our goal is not to avoid conflict. Our goal is to learn how to handle it in a healthy way.
Absolutely.
And I know we've said that a number of times. So the first danger to avoid is the danger of isolation. The second danger to avoid is really big. You read verse 2, hon, and I'll get verse 17.
All right. So Proverbs 18:2 says, "A fool hath no delight in understanding, but that his heart may discover itself."
He doesn't want to have any understanding.
Right.
And all he wants to do is be right. I don't want to understand this. I just want to be right. Verse 17 says it in this way: "He that is first in his own cause seemeth just, but his neighbor cometh and searcheth him." In other words, I'm convinced I'm right. I'm right.
Right.
I'm right. And so I can defend myself on the fact that I'm right. I don't need to understand. I'm just right. However, when your neighbor, someone else comes along and examines it,
Yes.
it gives a whole new light to it.
Absolutely. I would think that that is a danger to avoid, whether you're speaking from the parent's point of view of I am always right.
Sure.
And I know what to do in this situation. We need to seek wisdom. But I would think also from your teenager's point of view, when they are so convinced that it would be the wise thing to go and do some dangerous or foolish thing that
Sure.
sometimes teens want to do.
That's true. But in light of conflict resolution, there's a massive danger in misunderstanding the issue.
Yes.
And that can go in all kinds of directions. It reminds us that sometimes we jump in with both feet and an open mouth.
Yes.
and,
Yes.
and lots of emotions. And the next thing you know, we are really all upset and uptight when we don't even yet know what the issue is.
True.
So Solomon is saying there's a danger of isolation. There's a danger of misunderstanding the issue. And we'll explain more about that when we get to the areas to develop. Verse 3 is telling us there's a danger of showing contempt. Read that one for us.
"When the wicked cometh, then cometh also contempt, and with ignominy reproach."
That's an interesting word there, ignominy.
Yes.
But what we want to focus on there is that word contempt. And what he's trying to say in the third verse is that it is a wicked thing to have contempt. And so many times when we counsel parents who are struggling with teens or teens who are struggling with parents, it's resolved. It's kind of boiled down now into a contemptuous relationship.
Yes.
The teen is contemptuous toward mom and dad. It shows up and they roll their eyes, they sigh, they shrug their shoulders.
Yes.
And sometimes parents do the same things to teenagers.
Yes.
So Solomon is saying, here's another danger. It's the danger of contempt. Verse 5 introduces us to a pretty hefty one here as well. It's the danger of partiality or inconsistency. Read verse 5 for us.
"It is not good to accept the person of the wicked, to overthrow the righteous in judgment."
In other words, what we end up doing is we show partiality. We're inconsistent. And everybody knows that teenagers are really good at spotting inconsistencies
Yes.
unless it's their own.
Of course.
And if you're a teen listening to this, you know that's true. I know several times I've told our sons, make sure you are at least as hard on yourself as you are on others. Because it's so easy to think, I can't believe they're that way, and overlook the fact that, wait a minute,
Right.
I can't change them, but I can change me.
Yes.
So there's a massive danger, Solomon says, in being partial or inconsistent. And I always love our friend Dr. Dave Tice. I heard him say one time that he said, "I am so glad that I am at least consistent in my inconsistencies." and the reminder there is that none of us are across the board consistent all the time.
Right.
But when it comes to resolving conflicts, we have to recognize there's this danger in showing partiality. And maybe that's a reminder if you have more than one kid to make sure that you're not really hard on one, soft on the other.
True.
And I've taught many times that sometimes it happens when you have more than one child, that sometimes you feel really strongly about something, and this one child struggles in that area, so you really come down hard on that child.
Right.
And maybe the other child, they struggle because all kids do, but it's not something that's that big a deal to you. So you let their issues slide.
Right.
And that's a real problem, and it
Yes.
causes major issues in a family. So here's the dangers to avoid. Number 5 is the danger of contention. You find that in verse 6.
A fool's lips enter into contention, and his mouth calleth for strokes.
When there's contention involved, we are not resolving the conflict. And notice that the contention is not the issue. The issue is not where we get the contention. The issue shows up in how we talk about things.
Right.
And so you can have all kinds of conflict, but once you start discussing them, if it boils down to contention, you got a danger.
True.
And so these are things that we find in the Bible, but don't miss them. To take time to apply them to your own life. Do you have this danger of isolation to where you separate yourself, not to seek wisdom, but just because you're upset and mad and then you don't deal with it?
Right.
Think about it. Do you really struggle in this area of misunderstanding the issue where you don't listen? You don't try to understand? You don't look for the full details before you react? Are you apt, and be honest with yourself, because you can't solve conflicts with a teenager if contempt is part of your life. And if in your own heart you're feeling that contempt, then you better know that's a major danger. It's going to stop the resolution.
Right.
And it will not work. There's a couple of others here, though. Let's see. The danger of assuming is a big one. This is in verse 13. I found this one intriguing.
He that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is folly and shame to him.
He just assumes. He doesn't
Right.
hear it. I know what's going on here.
Right.
One thing that all of us have to stop and remind ourselves is we do not know motives.
True.
I cannot know your motive. You cannot know mine. I can think I do.
Right.
And so many times we are convinced that I know why you did that. I know what you're thinking.
Right.
And that is not possible. So the Bible is reminding us here there's a major danger in assuming.
And we could even say with our teenagers, more often than not, we're saying to ourselves, what were you thinking? Or we even say it out loud to them. Instead of, I know what you're thinking, we're saying, what were you thinking? Meaning we know that they didn't think at all, which may not be true. They may have thought it through and just came to a wrong conclusion.
They may have absolutely on purpose decided to do wrong.
There we go.
And so there's a danger in assuming. There's one more danger that we're to avoid. It's found in verse 19 of Proverbs 18, and it's the danger of offending. Listen to this verse.
A brother offended is harder to be won than a strong city, and their contentions are like the bars of a castle.
Notice what he's saying there. When we allow the conflicts of our life to result in our offending each other,
Yes.
It's almost impossible to win that back. And he says that person ends up with the contentions. Now it's interesting because when I offend, the issue is no longer the issue. Now the issue is the offense.
Yes.
So we can't even go back to what was originally the problem. We're way beyond that. Now we've created a new problem. There's offense involved. And that goes back to those wrong ways to argue that we talked about last week.
Right.
Because if we're not careful, if we handle things wrong, we offend our teenager or our teenagers offend us. And now it's hard to win. And
Right.
the Bible doesn't say it's impossible to win, but he says it's harder to be won than a strong city.
It's very hard. Yes.
In other words, now there's a battle involved, because to defeat a strong city requires a battle and a lot of time and a lot of effort.
It does.
So these are dangers to avoid. Any thought you would have before we go to the next section here?
I would just say that verse is very true. I know just from, and we haven't had huge contentions with our teenagers, but I have a tendency when it's time to correct something or I feel that we're headed into a contentious area, I have a tendency to over talk, just talk too much and say too much. And then often when that happens, the teenager feel the brunt of that. And so they can be offended. And then not only have I not convinced them that they should not be doing whatever they're going to do, but now they are offended, as this verse says. And then I have this compounded issue that needs to be taken care of. So be very careful as we open our mouths. And so we're going to talk about that here in just this next
and
point.
I would even jump in right there and point out the fact that whereas it is true in the way maybe even women in general, because of the emotional nature God designed
Right.
in your life and in your heart.
Yes.
But as a dad, I've also noticed that oftentimes I can help with that. If I can tell that the kid is feeling like, oh my word, mom just unloaded on me, then it's an opportunity not to belittle mom, but an opportunity to teach a child how to respond to that. And so I've often said, not often, but I have along the way said to one of our kids, listen, mom was right, and so show respect. And you may not maybe mom could have said it differently, but she was right. So think it through, show
Right.
respect and think it through, because we're pointing our kids to authority. There's so many angles involved in this conflict resolution with kids.
Right.
There's making sure our tongue is right. There's making sure our heart is right, but also teaching them how to respond and how to show the right attitude, even when we're wrong.
Right.
Or maybe we could have said it better. Not even wrong always, but maybe we could have done it differently.
I would even, just this week, I had a kind of an illustration of that from one of our children. And we had been discussing a matter, and I didn't unload on this child, but it's something that we've been discussing off and on probably throughout the summer. And so I did say a lot. And after a while, I just looked at this child and I said, "Oh, okay. So I just said a lot. Are you okay?" And they said yes. And I said, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say too much. And this child just looked at me and said, "Nope, you're right." And so I know that the training that David has given them, when mom decides that she needs to correct you and maybe says overmuch, it's okay.
It is. And Dad, you jump in there and help. And,
Yes.
And parents, you defend each other.
Yes.
But it's not a matter of defending something that's wrong. It's a matter of teaching our children how to respond to times where we disagree, because it's going to be normal in life. It's not just a parent-teen relationship. It's going to
True.
show up with a boss that's more emotional, or a police officer that's more emotional.
Right.
And so learning how to handle all those is essential. So there's dangers to avoid. Now,
Yes.
we only have 4 minutes or so left in our episode today, but let's jump into the areas to develop.
All right.
Because the first one is that we do need to develop connection in verse 1.
Yes.
And let's just refer back to that, because that's the one about isolation. And that's where he says a man
Through
separates
desire.
himself.
Yes.
Because he wants to know wisdom. So what we're doing there, rather than separate ourselves from a problem, let's get wisdom about it and connect.
Yes.
So we have to develop connection. We're going to do a podcast on how to connect to your teenager. So that's coming up here in a couple of
Another
weeks.
episode.
Another
Okay.
episode. And then he reminds us to develop understanding in verse 2 and verse 17 again. Read that verse 2 again.
A fool hath no delight in understanding, but that his heart may discover itself.
Now, what does it take to understand a conflict? It takes asking questions and listening to answers
Yes.
and clarifying.
Yes.
So you ask questions, you listen to the answer, and then you clarify, did I understand you to say?
Yes.
So it's really about communication.
It is.
Conflict resolution here takes communication. You develop understanding. And it does lead us to this next one. We have to develop communication skills. And I like this third verse. This third verse is great because actually it's not the right verse, is it?
It's verse number 4, I believe.
Okay, go ahead and read verse 4 for us then.
The words of a man's mouth are as deep waters, and the wellspring of wisdom as a flowing brook.
There it is. And so think about that. He talks about a deep well. And the idea there is that what's in the well has to be drawn out.
Yes.
And there's work involved in that. There's a time factor involved in that. So what we have to do then is develop communication skills, so that what we find in teenagers is that teenagers tend to internalize and they hold things in.
Yes.
And you'll notice all of a sudden there's a teen who's not talking, a teen who is gloomy, a teen who is shut down.
Right.
And I've often watched teenagers, because I work with teenagers so often, and I'll see a teenager who is one way with his buddies. You can just see he's alive, and he's smiling, and he's laughing, and he's talking.
Yes.
But get him around authority, and all of a sudden he is a silent, no emotion, he's clammed up.
Right.
And that really shows that there's got to be some time, Mom and Dad, when that happens, where you are drawing out of your child what's there. That takes communication skills.
Yes.
It goes back to that. We don't accuse, we ask. We ask questions, we listen, we're learning.
Yes.
So we're developing communication skills. And then we develop loyalty. That's another area we have to develop. Confidence. Verse
Yes.
8. Verse 8 says it like this: the words of a talebearer are as wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. So I'm loyal to my kid. I'm not wounding them.
Right.
And kids are loyal to parents. And so the area that has to be developed there is loyalty and confidence in each other.
Right. And how we speak to one another.
Absolutely. And that shows up so importantly.
Yes.
Then we have to develop spirituality, because in verse 10, he says, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous runneth into it, and the righteous is safe.
Amen.
And so we handle this spiritually. Mom and Dad, you've got to you've got to run to the Lord about these conflicts.
Yes.
And teenagers, if you're listening, you got to run to the Lord. You got to talk to the Lord about this. It's so vital. You've got to develop this spirituality in your conflict resolution. Here's a couple of others, and then we'll shut down for the day. Develop humility. That's in verse 12. Read verse 12 for us.
Okay. It says, before destruction, the heart of man is haughty, and before honor is humility.
So destruction results when there's pride.
Yes.
And the opposite of that, of course, is humility. And that's why he throws that in there.
Right. And a lot of times I would stop here and say, parents, the reason that sometimes we have contention with our teenager, instead of having the normal conversation and maybe correcting some type of behavior, sometimes that contention comes because our pride has been hurt, because we are embarrassed over their behavior.
That can happen, yes.
And so instead of allowing your pride to get involved and thinking, how could you say that to me in front of my friends at church, and getting in the car and reaming them out all the way home, have some humility.
Absolutely.
And then get in the car and discuss things more calmly, and asking those questions. Hey, what's going on in your heart? Are you not feeling well today? What's going on? And then you don't have that contentious argument that develops. You just have a nice conversation where you can correct some behavior.
That is absolutely good advice. Well, we're out of time, actually. And these next three areas are worth our jumping into next week.
Okay.
And so if you'll join us next week, we're going to just kind of wind up the Proverbs 18 and talk about patience. That's a huge one.
It's huge.
We're going to talk about developing options. He talks about that in Proverbs 18, and we're going to talk about developing a friendship.
Yes.
And this is going to be one of the things we're going to highlight in coming days here. We're going to talk to you about developing a friendship with your teenager. And it's not a buddy-buddy relationship.
Right.
It's not one of those necessarily, but if you do the diligent work of developing a relationship in the years ahead, it actually turns into a buddy-buddy relationship.
Yes.
Because with our older children now, we can be friends. And we operate on the basis of we're close friends. And it's always an awesome thing when your teenager becomes an adult who considers you their best friend.
Right.
And so that's where we're headed with this. Any final thoughts then before we close out? And,
I think we've covered things pretty well up to this point, and we'll look forward to jumping in next week.
So read Proverbs 18 this week and underline those verses and think about them in light of conflict resolution with your teenager.
Yes.
All right. Until next week then, have a wonderful week and serve the Lord with gladness this week.
The Keeping It Young podcast is a Bax 5 Media production.